Welcome. Today's topic is advanced compliance and how to mitigate risk in Microsoft 365. Let me first start by introducing our guest presenter, James Province. In 2007, James started a technology company concentrating on lawyers and judges' technology needs, and this endeavor really captured his interest. After more than 20 years working as a litigator, James no longer actively practices law, but he focuses most of his time as a technologist. James now works as a managing consultant at Planet, and his talent is bringing knowledge and humor together to teach people and organizations how to leverage Microsoft technology to mitigate risk and liability. Welcome, James, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. I was so glad that my PR team wrote that for you, right?
Absolutely. Thanks, James. Well, before we get started with this discussion, let's quickly go over the agenda. What is advanced compliance? Defining risk, types of risk, avoiding risk. Then we're going to do a demo of the Compliance Center. James is going to take you for a little tour. And then how to get started with compliance. And then obviously, we'll obviously everyone's favorite topic always brings up lots of questions about licensing clarification and what's needed actually to run some of the things we're talking about. So a little housekeeping first. Let's now go to a first poll of the day. James and I are very curious where you are at regarding your organization's capability to do advanced compliance. Do you currently own any advanced compliance license today? Please let us know by responding now. And we'll give this a second or so. And results are coming in. Looks like 66% so far, 60, yeah. We've got a lot of folks with some security, so this is great. This is really good. So we'll move on. Yeah. So what is advanced compliance? It's the ability to safeguard sensitive data, right? It's about identifying and remediating critical risks within your organization. It's about investigating and responding to legal requirements, assessing compliance and responding to regulatory requirements. And Microsoft offers this a complete comprehensive data governance solution to help your organization manage risks, protect and govern sensitive data, and respond to compliance regulation. So, but what does this mean and what is your role? And that is the topic we're talking about today. James, tell us what this all means.
Yeah, great.
Actually, hold
great.
on, before we get started, James, let's take one more poll. Sorry.
No worries.
I've got another poll here, so if we could go ahead and launch this next poll. This is going to really set us up for today's topic. Remember, these polls are anonymous, so don't worry about responding. When was the last time your IT, legal and compliance or public disclosure teams had an in-depth review of mitigation of risks and policies and implementation? You know, has this never happened within the last month, last 6 months or so, when Office 365 was initially set up and then never looked again at it? And so we're going to just spend a couple seconds here while we're waiting. I want to tell you this is one thing that my chief risk officer did in North Carolina, and it really helped us get on the same page as far as what her priorities were and when she wanted to roll out things. And it helped us really come up with an implementation plan that supported her and her endeavors. So, oh, okay, here we go. Never, it's got 40%. James, what do you think about these stats so far?
Yeah, no, this is not surprising. And in fact, what's kind of fun is that I can see that actually some people already have been doing it, at least within the last 6 to 12 months, which is great. Some people obviously do it when they have the initial setup, but really, you'll take a look at the never. That is not a surprise to me that we have a high percentage of that. And really, what we find in the market is that very few people actually do have an effective review. Sometimes they will have a review, they have a meeting, but did they actually process through the information from both sides in the way that they really need to? So even though you may have had a meeting, it may not even be as effective as you really need it to be. But these numbers are really not surprising to me. How about you, Ken?
Yeah, I'm not thinking these are, you know, I'm a little shocked by the never, but, you know, and then I definitely understand when people just set up Office 365 for the first time. Within the last 6 or 12 months is pretty decent, though. I'm excited to see that. So
really, I'm not shocked by the never at all. I'm not kidding you.
You've been in this longer than I have as far as compliance and risk. So
that's true. That's true.
All right, let's get started. We got a full agenda today, so let's get started with talking about risk. James, tell us about this.
Yeah. So one of the things that I look at is when you look at high-level organizational goals, or things that C-levels really concentrate on. If it's a private company, it's increasing revenue, right? If it's a private company or even a governmental agency, controlling those costs, making sure that we keep the costs down. But really something that transcends all is risk. And C-levels may not say it, but in the back of their mind, one of the high organizational goals that an organization has is to mitigate risk and liability. Why? Because if they don't do it, the organization can suffer financially. If it's a private organization and it suffers enough financially, they can actually close. So risk is really a broad statement of the threat of loss, injury, damage, negative consequences. But notice that the definition includes external or internal vulnerabilities. That is really the comprehensive view of risk, is that you have to look at it not just from the external perspective, but the internal as well. And that's really one of the things that I often tell people, is that when you're looking at a conversation, we often see the terms security and compliance pulled together. And as I mentioned in the blog, Ken, one of the things that I look at is this is simplified, totally get that, and there are overlaps, absolutely. But one way to start at least looking at the fact that there's an internal and external is think of security as partly protecting your organization from the outside in. It puts that moat around your data and your organization, and it's protecting from the outside bad actors. Compliance, on the other hand, is internal. It's from the inside out view that this takes place. And so what you really want to be thinking about is external and internal. And that's why security and compliance are both things that you need to look at. But while there is overlap, they really are have some very high distinctive values to it. Excellent. So go ahead and move to the next slide, if you would. Great. So when we look at types of risk, Ken, why don't you talk about the first one? Because I know that this is one of the things that you, when we were talking about this presentation, that's something that really lit up your face when you were thinking about it, right?
Yeah, so, obviously I live this, and I think the biggest mistake is people think that Microsoft has set all the configurations and safeguards in place for you. But, a SaaS service is a SaaS service, and it requires your configuration. This may sound like common sense, but you need to know what the defaults are of each one of the services, both the current services and the new services that Microsoft's rolling out. You can't just sit down and ignore it, whatever's coming down the line, right? So this is an ongoing task you need to do, and you have to have a role and play in this configuring of your own services to make sure they meet your needs.
Absolutely. And then when you look at other types of risk, right, where do you start? What are you going to protect? What sort of insider risks do you have? Do you have communication risks? Do you have somebody that potentially could be downloading information that is IP, intellectual property, that they run the possibility of taking that to a competitor? There are understanding also the fact that IT has a huge impact on legal liability. And we often think of these as very siloed, right? We think of legal over here and compliance over there. And, even if it's a governmental agency, public disclosure is over there. And IT is handling the certain, technical components. But the reality is that all of those intersect. And IT is often holding a legal liability bag that they don't even realize. And so that's one of the things that we love to tease out when we think about risk, is looking at it from a more comprehensive perspective as well. Yeah. And then, of course, the licensing, which you're going to be spending some additional time on as well, right?
Yeah. So concerning not knowing how or what to protect, if you read this month's blog, we discussed communications compliance just briefly. There's actually another blog a few months back on sensitive information in Teams. Definitely take a look at those. But the key here is that many people don't even realize, and they have to stay up to date with this information, right? You need special licensing to cover DLP in the chat of Teams, right? So even though you might have set up DLP for Exchange and OneDrive and SharePoint, you still need that's not going to cover you in the DLP for chatting in Teams itself. So we'll talk more about that a bit when we discuss licensing.
Yeah, so when you look at that, you really need to be thinking about those different perspectives. Now, let's dig into really the heart of risk is ultimately liability, right? And so having practiced law for 20 years and being a litigator, I was in court dealing with all different types of liability. I did not I think I only did a couple of criminal cases very early in my career. I always told people I didn't mind risking people's money in court, but I did not want to risk their freedom. So, but when you look at liability, it has really a huge impact on an organization. civil and criminal, it does indicate this, and that is very true, right? There are HIPAA violations can not only be necessarily just, financial, civil, but there could also be some potential criminal aspects. Same for different types of regulations of confidential data, depending upon what your organization deals with the government sensitive information. So when you think about liability, what I always do is start putting on that legal hat and start to realize that there are different aspects of legal liability that occur. We've got contracts maybe that have been breached or that we assert have been breached. We have torts. Torts are personal injuries. So there could be a slip and fall on your organization, or there could be actually something even stronger from an employee that was dismissed and brings a claim for discrimination. How do you deal with it? Well, ultimately, it's going to be evidence is found in the electronic arena, and legal and compliance and public disclosure that's some of these intersections that you have. So there's also fines that an organization faces. But one of the things I want to say about legal liability, Ken, is that most people think about legal liability when it comes to messing things up with electronic data. They think of fines, right? You think of a fine from a governmental organization. But one of the things that happens is if you're in court, a judge can also fine you. Okay, those fines can be astronomical. What type of fines could there be? Financial, because you didn't retain the right material for the right period of time. You didn't produce it through e-discovery. But the other thing that a lot of people don't realize, and this is so significant, if anybody is in the legal arena on the call, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, which is a judge can not only just say, you know what, I'm going to fine you for not producing the right material. If it's egregious enough, a judge can actually say you lose the case.
Yep.
Okay, I've been in court when I have seen this happen, where a judge looked at the evidence that was produced and said, I feel it's insufficient. You didn't produce the right material. You don't have it to produce. Whatever the reason is, you lose the case. They turn to the other side and they say, the question isn't whether you win. The question is now how much you win. And they turn to the person that has just lost and they say, we're not listening to whether you are liable or not. You're liable. We're only dealing with how much. Yeah. That risk can put an organization out of business. That risk raises the cost of insurance if they have to be continually making claims. So the legal liability is the heart of risk, and the mitigation of it has to take place. And there's a lot of moving parts that occur here.
Yeah, and I think the balance there is what level of liability. Some people just put everything on hold forever, indefinite hold, right? So there's a liability for that too, because you don't want to have data that's old now and that's irrelevant and may incriminate your organization possibly as well because you held on to it too long and it's not really relevant anymore.
Absolutely. And so to talk about that just for a second, because that's a great point you bring out. If you talk to most lawyers will say, we don't want to keep all this data forever because why? It creates a fishing expedition for the plaintiff in finding new causes of action and allowing other people to find liability. Yeah. So there are regulations for how long data needs to be kept for some types of data. There's also industry practices that are done, but each organization needs to determine what type of data needs to be saved and for how long, and then get rid of it. I always call it the double-edged sword of retention. It's keep the right material for the right period of time, but then the other side of that sword is to purge the right material at the right period of time as well. And the idea that an organization simply says, well, we're safe because we keep it all, most lawyers it's pretty rare that a lawyer would say we want that, but if they do, that's fine. But most lawyers are going to say, no, we need to be much more precise about that because we don't want you to keep things that we are not needing to keep here.
Yeah, and that's extremely difficult in a shared environment tenant like a state system where you've got 30, 40 different agencies and they all have their own requirements, but there are tools that do that. And we'll talk about those later in the episode here. But it's a very difficult thing because you're gonna have to get legal sign off from each agency saying what it is, and it's not so much a blanket 5 years, 7 years. It depends on what the
That's
content
right.
is. So it's very,
Well,
very difficult at the file level of what you need to keep and what you don't need to keep.
Absolutely. And Ken, I've often seen organizations that maybe have an elected official. Elected official may have different retention
Yeah,
policies that need to be
exactly.
applied versus a civil servant. So
Yeah,
there are so many nuances. But the problem is that when you don't bring in the legal team, compliance team, and public disclosure to really understand what the tools can do, they don't have the nuanced information to be able to make better policies.
right. Exactly. It's imperative to bring those two teams together. All right, let's go. We've got to get moving on here. So let's go to the next
Yes.
slide here.
So this is really the heart of what I look at. So one of the things that I have really, I think, helped organizations with is to understand that compliance is really a journey, and really to do the best practice, we need policymakers, policy implementers, and policy users. Now, what do we spend most of our time focused on? The policy implementers, that's IT. But to have IT set the policies, not just implement the policies, but to set the policies is really not fair to IT.
No.
Because IT doesn't know the legal issues involved in it. Yet sometimes from a legal perspective, they're just saying, well, IT's taking care of it. And yet you ask IT and they're thinking, well, I think the policies are being taken care of by our policymakers, legal, compliance, public disclosure. So the chasm that exists between these two teams causes real risk and real liability that can be devastating for an organization. I was at an organization one time where I was talking to the legal team, and I had the IT team in. That's kind of what we do for a workshop. We bring everybody together and do various things. But I was talking about teams, and the head of the legal team, and this is a regional financial organization, so multiple states, and the general counsel said, I don't even know why you're mentioning this thing called teams. We don't have it. I don't want to learn about it. And I knew they had it. So I turned to the IT team person. I said, oh, I thought you had teams. And he goes, we do. And I said, well, how many teams are deployed? And he said 2,380. And I looked back to the head legal person. The legal person's face just went white. And they said, are you kidding me? Do you put those on hold? What is our retention policy on this? And of course, the IT perspective was, you didn't tell me to do anything because we're implementers. So bringing implementers and makers together, but then also the journey does include the policy users. So to really look at this entirety of a journey, you really want to make sure that you're looking at makers need to be informed so they can make good informed decisions. They need to communicate those to IT and work together to make sure that they're using the tools correctly and maximizing the return on investment there. And then you have the end users that need to be brought along with how to actually use those tools. One of the things I always say is you can have the best policies in the world and the best tools in the world, and if your end users mess it up, you're in trouble. So looking at this as a journey is really something that I strongly encourage every single organization, whether you're a governmental organization or a private organization or a charity organization, any organization, you need it. Because if you have either a service or a product, or you're a governmental agency that has constituents, you face risk and liability. So we need to get this right.
Yeah, so set up maybe like a monthly cadence, or with your risk office between IT and risk, maybe the program manager of the 365 service, someone who can represent the service and know what it's capable of doing, and meeting with those risk people on a monthly basis or even quarterly basis, whatever it may be for your needs. But it's absolutely crucial and imperative. So it definitely helped me in my role in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the little tricks that we do, I'll just say, is that we, if you use our workshop, we do provide continuing legal education. So it sort of incentivizes lawyers to come in because most of them need to report that. So that's a little trick that we can help you with up our sleeve. Now, avoiding risk. So again, we've got IT and risk and compliance teams working together. You've got to have that knowledgeable staff. So it's not the case that every IT team has somebody that can specialize in the compliance center. So, you need to determine a strategy. Are we going to have somebody do that? Are we going to go outside for services for that? How is the legal team going to know what the capabilities are? All of those are moving parts that you need to look at. The correct roles, we'll talk about roles and permissions within the compliance center. It's very nuanced, and it's something that is often not explored very well. And I will tell you, the better approach to be more nuanced with it really provides better coverage for your organization. And again, last couple things, technical controls in place, monitored. We've got some organizations that have NIST requirements, FedRAMP. You've got CMMC issues. You've got HIPAA. You've got lots of different things. PII. You have various aspects of data. And let's face it, electronic data in organizations is exploding in size and complexity. And the answer is not to buy more space. The answer is to put controls on your data, to manage your data so that you have the mitigation of the risk and liability associated with that. Yep. And again, the licensing as well.
Sure. So I think, on the staff with correct roles, in a shared environment, make sure you scope out your e-discovery domains appropriately. Don't give out access any longer than it needs to be. Specifically during times of political transitions and you have new secretaries coming into agencies, right? I mean, you don't want the old secretary that maybe of a different party still having access to e-discovery access to that agency. Think about these things, changes of positions, and then access, right? Part of Zero Trust is all about privileged access and making sure that there's no standing access, right? So making sure you have controls in place to audit those roles. Don't give them out and then let those people have those roles forever, right? You got to have some kind of cadence. You're going to, if you ever respond to an audit, you're going to have to show that you're checking and auditing those roles on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the Compliance Center. One of the things you just want to say is it's compliance.microsoft.com. Again, if you don't have permissions to actually access it, you won't see it. But if you have permissions only for certain parts of things, you're going to see and surface the items that are relevant to you. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I think it's going to be, let's go ahead and dive into this. So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick here. And let me do a couple of little moves here just to make sure that we've got that over there. Oops, pardon me. Over here. Go in right here. Perfect. All right. So one of the things, let me do this. There we go. One of the things that I look at when I'm looking at a compliance center is all the moving parts are really pretty overwhelming for many organizations. You've got something like a compliance manager, which dives straight into, various regulatory requirements. You may have some financial requirements or some reporting requirements. Compliance manager is a good place to start, but you look at this and what you realize instantly, and this is one of the things that Ken and I were talking about, which is notice Microsoft Manage points. They've got that covered. But when you look at points that you can achieve, which are based on your mitigation actions. Yeah, exactly. Look, in this little test environment I spun up, I've got a whopping 27 out of 11,000 points that I could have. Now, points are kind of interesting because they at least gives you a scoring capability. But all that really is meaning, do you have the controls turned on? Do you have the right approach to these various items? So that's sometimes a good place to start to realize, okay, we may have a big problem here. What can we do? So I want to dive in, though, over here to permissions first. So the way that the Compliance Center works is it's controlled over here on the left-hand side. And the permissions are really an important area to start with, because what you don't have is everybody having all the permissions for everything. So when I go down here to the roles, just within the Compliance Center, one of the things that I want to call out is that the way that Microsoft has set this up is that there are many different roles that are already created that already have the right permissions associated with it. But you're not giving everybody the keys to the kingdom by saying you're now an Office 365 administrator because you need to do this one particular administrative role. That's the old way of thinking. The new way of thinking is to be nuanced and precise. If somebody needs to have the ability to work with insider risk management, you don't need to give them the administrative control of retention policies. Right? So they shouldn't even have that. So that's part of the zero trust approach as well, which is you're keeping the controls in who has access to the right things, not just in terms of data, but also in terms of the ability to control and manage the data and deal with the compliance aspect. Notice down here as I scroll through this, you've got a communication compliance over here, right? Communication compliance investigators, that's different roles. So if you click into this, You get a quick overview of what the role is and what the actions are that are available, case management, etc. But notice it's view the case for these things, right? But if we go over here to the instead, we choose the communication compliance person, we will look and we will have different roles over here that maybe are different than what we just saw a moment ago. So the nuanced aspect of the roles is really critical. The other thing that you should know is you can always create a role. So one of the things that I did just for demonstration purposes is I created a role over here. I'm going to call this super. Let's see if we can find one that says super over here and give it a second. And notice I created something called superpower. Okay, so when I click on this, what sort of roles did I assign this? Well, I happen, just for demonstration purposes, give every single role available to this persona that I'm playing. Why? So I could click around and make sure that I had access to everything that I needed to. But this is a critical place to start. And remember, you need to make sure that your policy makers understand what these roles can do, because they may say, you know what, we've always had IT do these things, but that really shouldn't be your burden. It's something we should take on. So maybe we should be doing the holds, the legal holds for this instead of having you do it. That also increases the speed with which the hold can take place. Instead of it bubbling up to the legal team and the legal team makes a request to the IT team and then the IT team processes it and assigns it out and then does it. What happened in the interim? The hold wasn't taking place. The hold did not take place for a period of days. What happened in the interim? Well, that's evidentiary issues that a judge may look at and say, boy, that was slow. I'm worried about what maybe we didn't have. If you didn't have a retention policy on that data, that this person maybe got rid of it. Those types of considerations have to be looked at not just from an IT perspective, but from those policy maker perspectives as well. Now, the next thing that I always tell people is to go down here to the catalog. In the solutions area, the catalog is, I think, one of the best places to get a good overview of what some of the moving parts are related to the Compliance Center. So the way that the catalog is organized is it's organized in different sections. You can see this section is called Information Protection and Governance. That's where you have your data loss prevention. Information governance, that's life cycle retention, that's keeping the right material for the right period of time, getting rid of the right material at the right period of time. Information protection, your sensitivity labels, right? So you've got various aspects of this that need to be considered. You also have a records management. So once something needs to be kept for a certain period of time, we're going to have a schedule that maybe has a review, or maybe we don't even need a review. It just gets rid of the material at the right period of time. But there are often times where you need to have an actual review of the material. It's 7 years. We need to have our records people look at this, but just because it's 7 years doesn't mean that we need to get rid of it right now. We need to have a human actually review this. So you can set up these types of policies. But again, the thing that I love about this, the catalog, is if I scroll down, I have another entire section related to privacy management. If I scroll down further, I've got insider risk management. This is what we were talking about a moment ago with, insider risk for things that your employees are doing that are risky across your organization. Communication compliance. Are there possible violations with inappropriate messages being made? Instead of being reactive to something that is reported as a problem that becomes a liability issue, manage your risk early, right? That's part of what we saw the definition of risk is to manage it early. So getting into the communication compliance. But then it all rolls up in the catalog to the very end, which is called the discovery and response area. So this is where you see things like your audit. We're going to dive into audit a little bit. You've got your e-discovery and advanced e-discovery. I've got a case that I've created so we can dig into this a little bit as well. But a good place to start your conversation, even just within the IT team, is to look at this catalog and start to map out, all right, who are the people that we need to have involved in these conversations? What are the different considerations that people need to have? The problem is that often legal compliance and public disclosure don't work really closely with IT because why? There's a technical barrier there. There's technical language that's used on one side and there's policy language used on the other. So think about how you can bridge those gaps and use language that the policymaker team can understand so they can make better informed policies. Now, what I want to do is I want to dive in just to a couple sample of these because I know we don't have all day here, but I want to show you a couple of these. So let's dive into information governance. And this is, again, the life cycle or retention policies. So we see a little bit of information here. You see the score impact that you can have based on this, shows you subscription information and permissions that are needed, gives you even an overview of the new items in this. Again, that's why catalog is a great place to start. Okay, we've got that overview. Let's go ahead and dive in. Now, when you look at this, you realize, oh, yeah, so retention policies, that's where I'm going to go. All right, so let's look at this for a second, because when you look at something like a retention policy, you start to realize if you go to take a look at one, let's go to over here to employee records. We can see that this applies to certain areas, what the settings are, et cetera. But let's dig into it as an actual editing of this. So when I click into this, this gives us an idea of what was built around it, okay? So we go here, we click the type, and instantly we see we have an option for either adaptive or static. Now, static for retention policy is location-based, and I guarantee you most of your legal compliance and public disclosure teams will always analyze retention policies from a location as opposed to content. Why? Because they think that's what the capability is. But when you start to expand the fact that you can have static policies for certain types of locations, but notice you have the ability to include or exclude certain Exchange accounts or SharePoint sites or OneDrive or groups, okay? So these start to take on a more nuanced and precise role. So even when you look at a policy that is location-based when you're looking at retention, ultimately, there are more nuances than saying all Exchange is held for 7 years, okay? Why is that a problem to say that? Because you may have a CEO that has a Securities and Exchange Commission issue, or you may have an elected official that has a different issue. So you may have a location-based policy, but just saying it's location and this is it is not good enough for when you're really trying to mitigate your risk. And frankly, when you face it in court, you need to make sure that you have these things configured correctly. Now, that's policy. That's one option, and that's where most people go. And that's fine. But on the other hand, you also have the ability to have labels, okay? Now, labels apply to individual documents or folders. This is where the magic happens and the light bulbs for the policymaker team starts to pop and realize, wait a minute, are you telling me that we can now have something that is more controlled for a deeper level that is needed? Well, let me give you an example of this, why this is important. Let's say that somebody is going to be saving a document in a SharePoint library. Great, but that SharePoint library has a 5-year retention policy on it. The end user knows that this particular document, though, needs to be kept for 7 years by our regulatory or legal requirement. Okay, but as soon as they put that document in the retention label, or excuse me, in the library that has a 5-year retention policy on it, what happens? 5 years, it's gone if that's the retention policy. Now, what happens for the next 2 years? You're vulnerable. That vulnerability causes fines and loss of litigation. It causes regulatory organizations to get involved in sanction. Okay, it causes potential problems for a governmental agency that didn't keep the right materials for public disclosure. Liability and risk is instantly increased, and it can't be mitigated at that point because it was not properly set up. Now, on the other hand, if we have a label that end user looks at this and says, oh, this needs to be 7 years, even though I'm putting it in a library that I happen to know is 5 years, I'm making sure that this document is kept for 7 years. Now, when there's an investigation or litigation or public disclosure or any regulatory response that is needed, that document is available in the way that it should have been. Okay, this is critical, but I will tell you, most policymakers have never heard of the idea of a label influencing the retention. Now, remember that little arc that I had in the actual the setup, right? That arc is something that you look at and you realize that is where you have end user, policymaker is the policymakers, policy implementers, and policy users. Now, I'm going to dive over into audit as well, because audit is something that can be a really critical issue, and Ken's going to be talking more about the advanced aspect of this. But when you look at audit, and you can talk even from a legal perspective, we often think of audit as maybe researching security breaches or things like this. But if you were to ask a lawyer a question, from e-discovery, from looking at the evidence, we know who drafted the document and who made changes to the document. But do we know who viewed that document? No. Could that be relevant in a case? Absolutely. Well, you take a look at audit, and what you have here in this dropdown is notice for file and page activities accessed the file. So now we know not only who created it and modified it, but we know who accessed it. That can be critically important from a risk and liability. You've got various things here in this. You've got even, if you go down, I'm just going to scroll down here, Power BI, who created the dashboard, who edited it, who deleted it, who shared it, who viewed the Power BI information. This is something that now that we have more and more electronic data occurring in instances, it's not good enough to say we have access to the data, but we need information about that data. Okay? Information is how our organizations run. Controlling it, putting the right access to it, information barriers. Maybe you have a department that shouldn't be seeing or communicating with another department. You can put an information barrier on this so that the financial services team does not interact with the marketing team where they're working together. That's an SEC violation, perhaps. These considerations help to elevate the abilities of protecting your organization and mitigating your risk. Now, I know we're getting close to time here. I just want to show a couple of other quick things here. I want to just dive into advanced e-discovery for a moment, and I want to show you something. So let's say there's an actual investigation that's taking place. Irvin is suing us, all right? So what does this look like? Well, in advanced e-discovery, if we go over to our data sources, we have access not only to Irvin's exchange information, but any team that Irvin is involved with, we have the ability to put that on hold and to dig into the data. Any SharePoint sites that Irvin is involved with, any OneDrive for Business that Irvin has had in his own environment. We have the ability to collect the data and do review sets. So notice when we go over here to look at this, let's say we are doing an investigation and we see this email, and we realize this is an email that's pretty important to this case. We have the ability to review it right here. We have the ability to look at the metadata associated with it. We can even annotate it. So we look at this and say, this document is relevant, but what we cannot do because of attorney-client privilege or because of privacy purposes, we need to redact a certain area, right? So let's go ahead and choose this ability to redact it. And we can go over here and select this area, and now that's redacted. Maybe we are working on some tags related to this. So we can go over here and add some tags. You can go and add, this is going to be a location-based tag. So it's not just keeping your data and growing your size of your database and of your cloud instance. You've got to not only protect it from the outside, but you have to manage it, govern it, and protect it from the inside. And that, my friends, is compliance. So I know, Ken, we're kind of bumping on time, so I'll go ahead and pause and let you take back over. Is there anything else, Ken, that you wanted me to show real quick before I hop back to any slide?
I don't think so. No, that's great. No,
Great.
that's a lot of information.
I know.
And obviously this next slide isn't much better, right? So what I'm showing you here, thank you, by the way, James, that's incredible. And as you can see, it takes a lot to set this up. So you have to have really, this is one of those things where you, what is the saying? You cut one, you measure 3 times, you cut once or whatever. Like you want to have a well thought out plan before you start really going down this path. It's obviously a very powerful tool, and it's changed a lot over the years too. If you're used to the way that Discovery used to work in the past, it's very different. All these tools that he just showed you with Advanced Discovery are very new with the redaction and that kind of thing, and kind of packaging up before you actually export it. That's all part of Advanced, eDiscovery as well, which is new. So let me. We got about 15 minutes, and I want to make sure I save some time for questions. This slide I'm not going to go over much, except for the fact that there's a link at the very end of the presentation. We'll send it out as the follow-up as well. Each one of these links is hot. So this is what comprises of security and compliance. So definitely take a look. A couple of these things I want to highlight. The advanced audit, James mentioned quickly. By default, this is one of those things I hear all the time. People don't know that the standard audit logs are only kept 90 days. And if you need more than 90 days because of compliance, then you have to have a plan and you have to have licensing to support that plan. So with the advanced audit license capability, that's part of one of the security compliance packages, you can extend it up to 1 year. And then there's also another add-on SKU that can go up to 10 years for the ability to save those logs. So think about that as well. Information protection, a lot of these things are based on whether or not they're manual versus automatic triggered. So that's kind of how you look at some of these protections. But obviously a very huge benefit there to start looking at information protection, data loss prevention for teams, especially. As I mentioned, you're not covered from a DLP standpoint if you've done it for Exchange Online, OneDrive, and SharePoint. You have to have a different license for that chat capability in Teams. So remember that. We'll talk about that in a second. Privileged access management. Again, we talk about role management, right? It provides granular access control over the privileged admin accounts in 365. So think no standing access as part of, zero trust. That's a part of this right here. I want to hit on that one. And then finally, records management. Don't put everything on legal hold. That's not the answer. A lot of people do it.
That's right.
Records management can help you with that. So here's some steps. I think James went over a lot of these things. Configure your compliance permissions first, obviously, right? Know your state of compliance. Obviously, you can't, it's difficult to know where to go if you don't know where you are, right? So meeting your compliance needs includes understanding your current level of risk and what updates may be needed. As James said, the Microsoft Compliance Manager can help you understand your organization's compliance posture and highlights areas that need to be improved with that compliance score. And then James also mentioned this, which is really important. Security and compliance are tightly integrated. They're not separate, right? So they also depend on each other. It's important that your organization addresses basic security, threat protection, and identity and access management areas to help provide a defense in depth approach to both security and compliance. Moving down the list, obviously auditing your organization by default, it's not turned on. Make sure you're aware of that. For certain workloads, you got to make sure you turn it on. Creating policies and alerts, this is huge. In fact, a lot of folks don't even know they can create alerts. Things like if they all of a sudden see a user starting to download a whole bunch of data the day before they leave, right? So that kind of stuff alerts our folks. Like all of a sudden they're getting ready to walk out the door and they're downloading all the information proprietary to that organization. Huge capabilities there.
Could I comment on that too?
Go ahead, sure.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to say is, let's say the key employee has left. Let's do a look back. That should be part of what your offboarding of somebody should be, right? So we need to go back maybe that 90 days or 1 year. Let's look at all the downloads that they did. Did they download sensitive information? So it's not just an alert to tell us that it's happening, but an investigation may be something that takes place. Again, legal conversation involves IT. That's that bridge.
Yep. What about if they deleted everything the day before they walked out the door? So now they don't have the OneDrive, because if you don't have a retention policy in place, that's gone now. Even though, it stays around for, I think it's 30 days, but it only stays around from that point on. So if you don't have retention set, you've now lost all that data, right? So you need to start thinking about some of these defaults with each one of these services. And obviously that comes with good governance and structure of how you offer these services up.
Absolutely.
Oops, sorry. So obviously we talked about convention. Yeah, we talked about the rest of these, and then seeing what's happening with your sensitive data. So if I could just take a second there, sensitivity labels, There's things like Content Explorer that allows you to view all of your items that have been classified as sensitive information belonging to a specific classification, as well as other sensitivity or retention labels. Activity Explorer also helps you with monitoring what's been done with the classified and labeled data across SharePoint, Exchange, and OneDrive. So lots of great tools here. These are kind of like the ones, if you want to get started, this is what I would concentrate on.
One of the things I would also say is that there's a possibility of automating some of that. So there may be some things that you want to manually have your employees work on, the other things you want to automate it. That's all part of this advanced compliance as well.
Yeah. So this slide depicts some of the changes that have happened over time, depending on where you're at with your enterprise agreement and your licensing. The big news here is that a lot of new capabilities have been added. So depending on where you're at with your EA, the new licensing model looks like this on the bottom, and the new capabilities are things like we just mentioned: advanced audit, insider risk management, communications compliance, cloud DLP, endpoint DLP. Those are all now part of this suite. So this suite is the old licensing model, no longer available. I think as of April 2021, I think this new model went in place. So you can buy the whole compliance suite as a whole, as a suite, or you can buy individual components, that handle these towers between information protection and governance, between incident risk management, or e-discovery and audit. The problem is you want little bits and pieces of all of these. So that's where I get you, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So when we look at the licensing stacks, and I know this is complicated. Again, this is going to be in the links at the end here. I think we sent it out in the newsletter. This is the area that we're talking about. This is the e-discovery and audit. This is the insider risk management and the identity governance and governance protection. Here's a blow up of that. So you can kind of see, obviously advanced audit, if you have that longer than 90-day capability, advanced e-discovery, you obviously want that. Insider risk management, communication compliance, we talked about that. Information barriers, if you want to protect individual divisions and you don't want them seeing each other's data, that's huge. And then obviously privileged access management, that automation, that way of giving out no standing access for those global admin accounts or those privileged admin accounts. When we get down here on this last swim lane, things like advanced message encryption, being able to on the fly look for DLP and email messages, and also the capability of chat messages and Teams. So again, there's a little bit of each one that you want. So unfortunately, you're going to have to either, you have to figure out what you want to do there. So let's go to one more poll here. So after today's session, we're wanting to know, how did we do? Do you have a better understanding of where we're at and what it takes about the risks in your environment and how to mitigate them? Please go ahead and give us your feedback in the. Hopefully this was really helpful, and we'd love to hear some feedback in a second and hope you're getting some questions ready to go. Excellent. So it looks like everybody has definitely found today's session very helpful, and looks like they're looking for some more information as well. So yeah, just what we figured, this was probably eye-opening for some. Maybe some of you have already started doing this.
It's that scratch the surface scenario, right?
Exactly, James. Scratching the surface, because I mean, this is a big component of, there's so much capability and controls in place here. You can imagine if you're trying to support 160 controls or whatever it may be, whatever standard you're trying to meet from a compliance standpoint, how much it takes to really protect that data and then, defend it from an audit. All right, so I mentioned, here's all the links that we're going to give you. As far as the follow-up, some of these were in the newsletter. I've added some more. Everything I talked about today in the presentation is in here as well. Those licensing diagrams I mentioned, how to get started, all the details of each one of those capabilities and security and compliance, they're all in right here. And definitely check out this other older blog, as well as James's new blog this month on our Planet Perspectives blog location.